Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in our five-part panel discussion series addressing some of the fundamental issues and opportunities of Canada's EV charging infrastructure. I'm Nino Di Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'm delighted to introduce this episode, Charging EVs in Condos and MURBs, which is sponsored by SWTCH Energy. For multi-residential properties with limited electrical capacity, the transition to being EV ready isn't always simple. SWTCH was created to manage the complexities of adding EV charging in both new and old buildings. To minimize infrastructure costs, SWTCH utilizes a scalable network of solutions with intelligent load management that works for your EV drivers today and for your EV drivers of tomorrow, ensuring your properties can effectively support rapid EV adoption across Canada. So far, SWTCH has deployed and managed thousands of chargers on the SWTCH network across North America. And they're just getting started. We're grateful to SWTCH Energy for their support of this discussion. Well, securing EV charging in multi-unit residential buildings remains one of the most challenging areas of public infrastructure for both residents, boards, and infrastructure installers. So today we're going to look at what's being done by governments at all levels, developers, and building managers to bring clarity to what can be a frustrating process that varies by province, community, and even building. We've got some superb speakers today, and I'm delighted to introduce you to them now. They are Graeme Armster, Director, Innovation and Sustainability at Tridel. Brendan McEwan, Managing Consultant at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. Reid Arkinstall, Program Manager at BC Hydro. Mike Mulqueen, Director of Partnerships at SWTCH Energy. And my colleague, Emma Jarrett, Managing Editor of Electric Autonomy Canada, who will be moderating the discussion. With that, I'm going to pass over to Emma, who's going to take the lead on the conversation.
Thanks, Nino. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all here. This is a topic that we constantly hear in our day-to-day work that is just on everybody's minds. So very excited to get to host this discussion. So Brendan, could you kick us off by giving us a bird's eye view of the EV charging landscape in MURBs, condos, and stratas across Canada? And we will go from there, please.
Sure. Well, hey, thanks so much. Pleasure to be here. So as was alluded to, access to EV charging is really, at-home EV charging is really critical to enable households to adopt EVs. Unfortunately, compared to single-family homes, if you've got at a single-family home and an on-site parking space, it's relatively costly and complicated to implement EV charging in multifamily buildings, usually. So to give a sense of that, I think the average cost to install a single EV charging station in a multifamily building might be about $8,000 to $10,000, although it can really vary. And it's quite a complicated, lengthy, and really uncertain process to implement an EV charging station, to convince your condominium association or rental building owner to allow you to do that. So when it comes to actions that have been taken to better enable access to EV charging in those types of buildings. Firstly, leading cities like City of Toronto, Vancouver, 18 other cities across Canada have adopted EV-ready requirements that require that all new developments, all the residential parking that's in those developments has to feature an adjacent outlet. So a wired infrastructure that terminates in a receptacle or a junction box that's going to make it easy for households to install an EV charging station at their assigned parking space. So that really simplifies the process to get access to that EV charging. And then for all those existing buildings out there, there's really promising programs to help multifamily buildings in implementing EV charging infrastructure. So the federal government offers the Zero Emissions Vehicle Incentive Program that offers up to $5,000 per EV charger. And there's similar incentives in leading provinces like BC and Quebec. And I'm a huge supporter of programs and policies that will support comprehensive 100% EV ready retrofits that help multifamily condos and rental buildings not just implement a couple of charging stations at a time, but really take a more holistic, comprehensive approach, do one major electrical renovation and future-proof that building with the same sort of infrastructure that's required in new construction, making every parking space EV ready so that all those folks are going to have a really simple process to get access to at-home EV charging over time as they adopt their vehicles. And the cost of doing that can really significantly reduce and be much more cost-effective over the life cycle of the building. When you're doing things in one comprehensive process, you've got economies of scale, and you can also design for load management and smart charging sorts of systems. So thanks, Emma.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. So I saw everyone nodding along very, very much. Excited to get everyone's thoughts. But Graeme, just touching on the resident side of this, what is Tridel hearing from its building residents, on the topic of EV charging and wanting access to it? How does what Brendan was talking about resonate with you? And does Tridel have a strategy to manage the costs that Brendan was discussing that are associated with getting EV charging installed in high rises?
Sure. So I guess I'll start and maybe provide a bit more context too as well by saying, so Tridel is a condo developer building, multi-use residential condos, predominantly in the city of Toronto. So like Brandon said, Toronto does have an EV ready policy. So that's really, when we're starting to plan for our new developments, that's really the starting point for us. So that starting point right now is energized outlet at every single parking spot. So when we start there, the next step really is understanding, now that we have potentially infrastructure that provides power to every single parking spot, maybe really the next question is, how to manage that power. And I guess, from us, a good starting point is understanding, well, how many of our customers on each new development is typically asking for EV infrastructure right off the bat. And that's growing over the years. In checking in with our sales and marketing department recently, we're starting to see numbers around 30%. So 30% of our buyers who ask for parking spots are looking for charging. And the demographic there is, really twofold. One of which is these people have EVs already and they need the infrastructure day one. But as well, when I walk our garages, I see a lot of people still driving, combustion engines and they're parked in EV spots. But really what that tells me is they're planning for the future and probably their next vehicle will be an EV. So from there and going back to managing the power, really, if the power is there already, the next thing really is, okay, well, if we have 30% of our buyers off the hop asking for EV charging, we like to typically include EV chargers in those spots, and the EV charging supplier that we want to partner with is one that has future proofing capabilities. So one that, as these outlets start to get used more and more, meaning, people notify their condo that, maybe day one they're not using it, but they are going to use it later on, which triggers a charging station being added. It's a smart charging, power management capable charging station. And we don't turn those features on day one because, why force users to pay for a feature that maybe isn't benefiting them from the standpoint that the smart charging capabilities really allow you to manage high volumes of power that will generate a return on that investment. But if you're not consuming high volumes of power, there's no need to unlock and turn that feature on and create an unnecessary cost for users. So really what we're doing is, making sure we have these future-proofing capabilities, as well as guidance in the condo docs and declaration that guides the condo as well as the users, so that there's clear instruction that, when you hit this threshold, then you have to turn on the smart charging capabilities so that now, one, the infrastructure is protected. You'll actually see a return because the demand charges, at night, 6, 7 o'clock when everyone comes home and plugs in, instead of everything just turning on and charging, and now, you paying a penalty for those high demands, the EV supplier can manage that for you so that now you're consuming power responsibly and in a cost-effective manner that's going to save money at the end of the day. So that's really, in terms of, if I were to kind of wrap it all up, 3 things maybe to summarize. One, 30% of our buyers are asking for it. We're not at a point where we need demand management yet, but you should be planning for that. And then giving, condos as well as buyers clear policy and direction in the condo docs so that, everyone's treated fairly when the time comes and needs access to power.
Thanks, Graeme. And just quickly on the cost perspective, because we are getting a couple of questions on that. These are expensive pieces of infrastructure. So how are costs being managed?
Yeah, so I think if we broke it down into 2 parts, well, one, we have to provide an energized receptacle to every single spot in Toronto. So that you don't have a choice, you got to do that. And then number 2 is, okay, the charging station. We believe that we don't want to provide charging stations unless people want them or are going to use them. And the reason being is because technology is changing so quickly that we don't want to put 100% EV charging stations plugged into a receptacle into a site, because one, that's not a smart way to manage cost if the equipment's going to be sitting there and you're not using it for a while. So we are very much approaching it from the angle of providing what's needed now, and then with that guidance of guiding how you add charging stations in the future as well as how you add the smart management. That's how we're managing costs. So majority of the cost is already dealt with in the fact that that energized outlet is there already. So really, the smaller cost is adding the charging station after the fact. And again, we're only putting it in there if customers want it, because we don't want stranded infrastructure that could get outdated and have to be replaced anyways. So it's very much the approach of just what you need now is going in, and that's it.
Thanks so much, Graeme. So Mike, I relate what Graeme was talking about in terms of trying to measure a bit of an intangible, like condos are having to project into the future what they think their residents will need for EV charging. So how does SWTCH play into this in terms of being able to help condos and residents measure what is a realistic number of EV chargers to put in, and just deciding, is it even necessary for certain households?
Yeah, great question, and I really like the way Graeme kind of structured his response to the last question as well. So really important kind of first principles to follow in making sure that you are building a scalable solution for the building. So as Graeme said, you're responding to today's need, where you might be in a market where, say, 5% of people have an EV. You might have another 5 to 10% that are thinking of buying one in the next year, so they might be interested in a charging station. But the building, has to plan for the long term, because that's, there's electrical infrastructure and networking infrastructure that needs to support upwards of 50 to eventually 100% EV vehicle adoption. So you don't want to build out in a way that's going to preclude future EV drivers from being able to charge their vehicles at home. So, one of the things that we often see in the market when we first start conversations with, multifamily buildings, condominiums, is, everyone's really focused on a fast charge. And so they have this kind of gas station model in mind, where you're used to kind of driving somewhere to a destination, charging in 5 minutes, and then kind of getting on your way. And the reality is most EV charging, it's going to be much like how you charge your cell phone in the future, right? So it's going to be where your vehicle is parked for long periods of time. So that's at home or at work. And so the level of charging that you need, it's not a fast charger. It's typically a level 2 charger, so less than 25 kilowatts, so somewhere between 7 and 19 kilowatts typically. And because you have the advantage of time. Across our network, we see that it's usually around, 2.5 hours is the average charge time for a vehicle. So if someone getting home at 5, leaving the next morning at, 8 o'clock, lots of time to charge that vehicle. And that's what allows this dynamic approach to energy management. because you can kind of prioritize vehicles and prioritize charging in order to get the most out of that electrical capacity.
Thanks. And Reid, obviously you're representing utility here. We know that Vancouver has a lot of strata condo MURB situations going on. Just tapping in a bit deeper on that consumer psychology element that Mike was talking about. How would you like there to be sort of an education, a public education about how much power people actually need, how they will be charging, so that residents and condo boards that are making decisions about EV charging are going in with a real set of facts about what they need?
Yeah, I can certainly, what I'm going to say is going to connect, I think, with what Mike was just saying and Graeme as well. But I would say one of the first key pieces of information that a strata I would recommend, get available to them is using their meter data. And what I mean by that is a critical piece of like assessing, how much power can each resident have to charge. It's about assessing the existing capacity of the building. So how much spare capacity. And so a key piece of that is where possible. I'm not sure, obviously we're across the country here. I can just speak to British Columbia, but we provide stratas with 12 months of their most recent buildings consumption. And so what that is that's the residential units. So say there's 100 units plus the common area, and we consolidate that and we give it back to stratas to basically use that information to determine, basically to share that with their electrician and or electrical contractor, who would then, or electrical engineer, who would then use that data to do a load calculation to assess the capacity. So, I would recommend if you're a strata or, residents, or, finding out, from your utility what process they have for you to get access to that information. Because conversely, if you're using, if industry is using the traditional approach, which is called a calculated load, where basically they're making, they're assigning potential like amperage amounts used by like your appliances and your lighting, and that can lead to a far different picture as far as how much spare capacity you have. And in my experience of running the program here in British Columbia for EV charging in condos, is the vast majority of condos have no issue with capacity. That's not to say there aren't scenarios, but when you're doing load calculations with data, you get a far more accurate assessment. So that's kind of first key piece. And then kind of tying back to what Mike and was just saying about, what's the appropriate amount of power. And I think no question, like we like things done, quickly generally. And the trade-off though is, faster speeds is more power and it's more cost. And so there's a balancing act within any condo situation where you're, wanting to balance what's appropriate with a reasonable cost. So what's a decent amount of power and speed where 90+% of the time residents are going to get their charging needs met. And so I think working with, qualified professionals who are experienced with looking at all the variables that a building needs to look at. So like the age of residents, where they're located, how much they drive daily and annually, how much spare capacity they have. And then that can all inform, what's the best design. And I think what, go back to what, Brendan and Graeme and Mike have said, it's around this scalability and looking at more of that holistic strategic approach. No question leads to really cost-effective designs. And certainly there could be more said about that, but in summary, it's use your meter data as much as you can, and really less power is arguably more than sufficient most times, and far more cost-effective.
Thanks. And I'd like to put on my catastrophic thinker hat for a second. Let's just say, worst case scenario, you're in a really old building. I'm sure a lot of the people who are grappling with this issue are looking at retrofits, which is different than what we've been talking about largely, which is, building EV ready new builds. So in that situation where your building is maxed out for power, what happens then?
Well, I should qualify. The world that I live in is actually all retrofits. So the program that we have in British Columbia is it's funded by the province of BC, and it's the Clean BC Go Electric EV Charger Rebate Program for homes and workplaces. And so we're actually assisting condos to retrofit in that large scale situation. And generally, what I found, I guess, to your worst case scenario question, Emma, is with energy management systems and that design, it is typically very rare that you will be in a scenario where you're going to actually exceed your building's capacity or not be able to satisfy, each resident getting access to charging. And so, however, if that is the case, what, can tend to happen is there's a compromise. So a large percentage is done today, and then they look at planning for the future where they do have to do a service upgrade, and they plan accordingly. And I guess the benefit of kind of what we're talking about today is if you do plan appropriately, this is a bit of a long-term, game that we're all playing. And so you can plan for it. So it would be a compromise of maybe doing a large portion today and then thinking how you're going to get adequate power in the future.
And if I could just build on that, Emma,
Yeah.
Until recently, I was working with an electrical engineering firm that did a lot of work with multifamily buildings on EV-ready retrofits to existing buildings. We probably did designs for, 50 or 60 buildings. All but one of those, it was very straightforward to be able to provide every resident with access to EV charging in their home, assigned parking space within the existing service size in that building. So there are some buildings where you might run into capacity constraints, but if you're doing sort of appropriate, careful design, they're very much the exception. And in those cases, frankly, a thing where you might want to talk to your utility, just see what it will cost to provide additional power to the building. Sometimes it's not a deal breaker. Sometimes it can be a really significant cost.
One more quick add-on, because this is a really important point. So like the availability of power, really it depends on the time of day, right? And what else is happening in the building. So your load in a building is variable throughout the day. So there's a whole lot you can do around energy management using, current transducers, so CTs, on the main phases of power, for example, so you can understand in real time how much power is available for charging. So you can do that at a panel level if there's a mixed load on that panel. So, lights come on, come off, there's HVAC equipment. And so you can make available for charging whatever that spare capacity is. So even in the most constrained buildings, we find there is a solution. So it's not going to, it's not going to be a 5-minute charge, but there is power available at all times. And most buildings by this point have done, LED lighting upgrades. They've put some controls on HVAC systems, and they've freed up some of that capacity. So their peak is a lot lower than when the building was constructed.
Yeah. So, if you're a multifamily resident out there or a condo board association member, and your electrical contractor is telling you you're at capacity, you can't get any more, you can't provide for EV charging, get a second opinion, because you could save quite a bit of money.
And even on our side, even on the new build side, I think it's a good point being made here that, too often, the electrical code, if there is no information, says here, use these diversity factors. But I think the key message here is, we're in an era of data, and you can easily get this data and start to avoid having to make assumptions and actually base decisions off of real life information. And I think that's the important message, even for a new developer who's being told by their engineer and the local hydro company that, hey, to accommodate your EV needs, we're going to require expansion costs. Maybe if you can gather real life data and use that to your advantage, maybe there's a happy medium that doesn't result in all these added infrastructure costs.
So I'm going to throw everyone a curveball for a second and loop in an audience question, because it's right on point with what we're talking about. So the question is, regarding metering, can EV EMS be configured differently depending on utility metering needs? particularly in new construction where EV charging consumption is often tied to a specific strata lot, can EV EMS be implemented? Similarly, for retrofits, can metering be tied to individual users' utility accounts, or does the EV system need to be on a single account? Anyone can answer that.
Yeah, one of the most important considerations around this is just in the background. So Measurement Canada is working on standards for kilowatt hour measurements and billing. So, right now across the industry, we're all billing based on hourly consumption and prorated for the actual. So if there's any energy management or a partial hour. So once we're able to bill for kilowatt hour, that's going to kind of enable the metering application, because there's just going to be a higher level of deemed accuracy for that charging transaction. EV chargers I don't think they're ever going to be deemed revenue grade meters under utility standard for utility collection, but certainly for, charging transactions, that the standard's being set right now. So I think that's the first part of the answer is we're all waiting on a standard. So that we can kind of start applying that new billing process.
And I guess to add to that, whether it's a new build or even an existing building, you could always approach metering in two ways. One, if you want kilowatt hour metering done now, then you would have to do it separately from the chargers, and with a Measurement Canada certified metering solution. And you could always inquire with a local sub-metering company to layer that on in behind the scenes to the charging solution. But I think for all intensive purposes, the more cost-effective solution is if you can include some form of metering right in the charging station itself and leverage the charging network. And in that scenario, like Mike said, right now, time, you'd be individual consumption would be charged based on time, which is still, relatively accurate and pretty close to ensure that the condo isn't paying for an end user's consumption. And I think right around the corner, Mike, I think if I'm not mistaken, like we're very close to you guys unlocking through approvals through the government, the kilowatt hour solution that's built right into your charging technology, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the province, I think it was around June, announced time of use pricing, but a pretty dramatic change for an ultra low overnight rate to encourage EV charging overnight. So certainly network providers such as ourselves and others, like we were all kind of built the capability in order to take advantage of that and encourage charging behavior as intended. So that's really important. So pricing can follow the hourly price of electricity.
I'll just offer one brief point on metering, and obviously this all comes down to like how do you appropriately recover the costs and charge residents for whatever electricity you're using. One of the limitations of, at least in British Columbia, of using a separate meter for an individual, so each resident tries to get a second meter downstream of their house meter. The limitations of that is that, at least in BC, it's not compatible with like energy management system designs. So we're trying to share multiple stations. And so what that can lead to is the need for like a dedicated circuit. And so usually like a 40 amp circuit. And that's typically far over an excess of what's actually necessary. So it can actually be far more costly to go down that approach if you're trying to do dedicated meters. And, like we talked about before, this whole concept of appropriate power with, multiple chargers on a circuit. So you're taking advantage of like energy management. So it is weighing out those costs of like, cost per stall plus collection of fees. And I think as Mike and Graeme alluded to, there's some alternative besides the traditional meter that are available to collect, the amount of electricity being used to support whatever the billing methodology is. So, in my opinion, that's not the recommended approach, is to add a secondary meter. That would need to be carefully considered if that makes sense in a particular situation.
Thanks. So we talked about a couple policy levers, the billing issue, both at the provincial and federal level, as well as building codes and it being legislated to have new builds be EV ready. But Brendan, do you see any other mechanisms that could be employed at any other level of government to give them a greater role in standardizing, for lack of a better word, EV charging in MURBs, stratas, and condos?
Yeah. So just, to reiterate quickly, for new construction, ideally provinces, but if the province isn't taking the lead, then leading cities should adopt requirements that all residential parking in new buildings be EV ready. And likewise, the federal government ought to adopt those same sort of requirements in the Model National Building Code and the National Energy Code for buildings that a lot of provincial building codes are modeled off of. So that's what we ought to do to sort of stem the bleeding for new buildings. To support existing buildings, the federal government, as well as provinces, should adopt incentive programs to make it easier for both multifamily condos and rental building owners to implement comprehensive retrofits that are going to future-proof a large proportion of parking for EV charging. So I think BC's EV Ready rebate program is really an excellent model that other provinces or the federal government, as part of a new stream within their zero emissions vehicle incentive program, can emulate. It provides support, firstly, for planning these kinds of comprehensive 100% EV ready retrofits, and then provides funding to buildings, $600 a parking space, I believe up to 120 grand per building, to make every parking space EV ready. So having that adjacent electrical outlet, a wired junction box or receptacle, where it's going to then be a really simple process to install a charging station that's capable of EV energy management and can work with a smart system for the whole building. So, I'm a bit biased. I played a role in helping to design that program, but BC is basically pretty much the only jurisdiction in North America where we've got this kind of comprehensive approach really used at scale. And it's ultimately going to result in a lot lower cost for these building owners and residents to provide EV charging. So when we're thinking about how do we enable large proportions of the population to adopt EVs, ultimately all vehicles transitioning to electric vehicles in the next couple of decades, it's really important that the federal government, as well as utilities and provinces, think about how to enable these types of renovations at scale and implement these, relatively complicated, need to be well-planned electrical retrofits, but that can really create a lot of value for the residents in those buildings.
Can I jump in and add one thing too?
Please.
Because I agree. I think I've seen a lot in the chat here, a lot of people expressing their pain around, trying to go to a condo board and, get power to their spot, and they're constantly turned away. So I think the government would be, very helpful from a policy perspective if they could come up with some overarching guidance and policy for condo boards. Because I think the common theme I see is, you have the one person, maybe the condo has EV infrastructure, but only designed to serve a small percentage of the spots. And then you hit the threshold of that, and then the next person after the threshold is the one who suffers. And basically what ends up happening is they go to the condo and they're like, hey, can I have an EV spot? Oh, sorry, we've got no more space left. You got to go find 14 other friends. And so that you can share the massive cost between the 15 of you to add EV, the next transformer and panel and all the back end infrastructure that's required to support each of those EV chargers. I think if the government could come up with better policy so that those kind of scenarios don't happen, and when that one person shows up and says, hey, I need a charger, they don't have to go look for 14 friends, and instead there's a clear policy that the condo has to follow in terms of meeting their needs for power. I think that would go a long way for a lot of the existing buildings out there.
Excellent. Well, as you alluded to, Graeme, we have very active chats and Q&As, so I'm going to bounce us into those so we can get through as many as possible. As I'll just say it again for everyone, it's a very popular topic. All right. So their first question is, can Stratas enable EV charging without subscribing to a service? In other words, without paying a significant margin for charging management?
I could add some commentary there. It depends what you're looking for. As a starting point, if you want your solution to be set up to offer sub-metering or some sort of way to, charge individual users for their consumption, then there will always be fees associated with that, because there's a level of administration on the service provider side to facilitate that kind of service. So I think, the fees will be there. You just have to make a decision on whether or not you want the fees to, or you can explore based on costs and quotes you get from vendors. But really your two options are to go on the sub-metering side with that vendor direct and keep the sub-metering separate. Obviously, I think it was either Reid or Brandon said, there's some things you got to watch out there if you approach it that way as well. Or you could do it built in to the charging station, at which you're going to pay some fees, or the end user will pay some fees to administer their account with the charging company. So that's part one. Part two would be, fees associated with energy management. And the discussions we've had with some of the vendors we've worked with is those fees don't have to be turned on day one if not needed. So if you have energy management requirements that maybe you're seeing in the future, when you hit a certain threshold on the site, you could work out something so that that's when those fees then come on, so that ultimately they're not costing you money, because smart management of the power could actually save you money, and then there's a return on that investment. So I think those are really the two fees to think about and how you want to leverage them when deploying the solution.
One consideration I'd add, and that was a really kind of good overview of the landscape and some of the considerations. The one thing I'd add, though, is around the service side, which a lot of people don't think about. So there's a bit of a race now for a lot of customers to get chargers in to kind of meet the immediate need. But what we've seen is kind of the service support is often an afterthought, and so it's a situation where you kind of get what you pay for sometimes if you're not paying any ongoing cost for someone to maintain the network, provide customer support. It makes it very difficult to get the service that you need when you actually need it. So all of us, I'm sure, have been on. We've heard EV drivers express their frustration where they've shown up to charge and the charging station is down, and no one is really kind of paying attention and making sure that that uptime is being maximized. So as a network operator, Switch actually takes it very, very seriously. And we've built a business model that, we collect money from customers every month, but that's in order to pay for the support and support a call center. So no matter what time of day, if your charger's not working, someone live picks up the phone. In the background, there's live diagnostics reports that are downloaded for each charger because they are networked and connected. So you're getting very good detail on those chargers, and you're able to act on that in a proactive way too. So it's both proactive and reactive, with the goal of making sure that the service is there for people who need it. But so that's so if you're not paying a monthly networking cost, the service provider, they might have a revenue model that's based on transaction fees on each charger. So something to consider, maybe if you're in a market where a lot of people are driving EVs, there's a lot of transactions, so maybe they are collecting enough to provide support, but there's certainly some markets where that doesn't work yet because there's just such a lower volume of EVs on the road, and so they're not actually collecting very much money today. They might in the future, but today, so again, you can be a little bit limited there in the service that you get.
One other thing to point out too, Mike, I guess, is on the fee side is I think, which Switch is set up quite nicely now, if I'm not mistaken, is understanding how your solution on your site that maybe you're entertaining interacts with the environment outside of your site. So meaning, if there's an app or some sort of software required to use the solution, it's great if that particular vendor is well connected outside the building. In some instances, we're starting to hear, roaming agreements. And I think if that kind of sets the end user up well, so that not only are they taken care of on their site, but also if they plan a long trip or something like that, and they have to charge, when they're not at home and they're out on public infrastructure, that, maybe they don't have to download all these different apps and everything like that, and they can just use the solution they're used to, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think we've all got enough apps on our phone, and certainly for drivers, that's one of the things that I think the industry is figuring out, just how to make it a lot more seamless for everybody. Yeah.
So, Reid, this one I think you're probably the best positioned to answer. Beyond kilowatt hour billing, wondering how participation in utility programs like time of use rates might work. The question would be whether the individual owner can participate, or would it need to be the condo board, the strata, the tenant?
Yeah, and I apologize. Somebody pointed out that my audio wasn't very good, so I'll try and move my mouthpiece closer to where I'm speaking. So, in British Columbia, we currently don't have any sort of time of use rates or any sort of voluntary time of use rates, and so there's a bunch of work that's underway currently as far as coming up with potential rate structures that would enable some sort of optional time of use. Condos is certainly a different consideration and poses a different challenge because of the fact that there is a common area meter, and we're not always able to directly tie to the individual who is actually consuming the electricity. So at this point in time, to be honest with you, I don't have a tremendous amount of information as far as how that could be done. I could just say that there are, I know there's colleagues in BC Hydro that are looking at, what could that look like in MURBs or in condos. It's far, quote unquote, more straightforward in a single family home or detached home setting. But I would say there's still a fair bit of work to be done as far as what that will actually look like in the future. So, and then I welcome Mike if you have any perspective, from what you're seeing back east, or Brendan as well. But that's more the BC landscape.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, at a high level, it's theoretically possible that in a multifamily building, even without a utility meter serving just that individual parking space, that a resident could have some sort of set of rewards for time of use. Like, let's say if utilities worked with EV charging service providers like SWTCH or others to say, hey, we want to reward individual drivers that are going to time their charging at certain points. Can you help facilitate that for us? It's theoretically possible. I think that we're probably likely to see it applied at just the meters and having sort of buildings opt into these sorts of initiatives, although it's really early days. We'll see how it shakes out. So hopefully that kind of high level perspective is useful.
For sure, yeah, and we see this actually being implemented in New York as well. Really, supportive set of policies around climate in general, but they've had some good success with time of use pricing to encourage overnight charging. So, yeah, it's going to be great when it's here in Ontario. I think I'm hoping other jurisdictions follow suit. And from an operator standpoint, it's pretty easy to configure that rate, kind of moving to a variable rate depending on the time of day, and as well as provide users that control as well, so they can schedule charging. So both things work together, because some people might be willing to pay more, and that's fine too. Maybe they're in a hurry, they want to go out that night, and they don't want to wait.
Thanks.
And just to add, just because you're not on time of use doesn't necessarily mean that you're not seeing like, if you do have energy management, you're not seeing benefits on the appropriate management of your power, because outside of the time of use rates or tiered rates, there are some delivery charges that are built in. One of which is the distribution charge and demand charge, and those demand charges, if you're drawing a lot of power at the wrong time, you will pay for that. So in a way, you are kind of getting some time of use discounts if you properly manage your power through the basic rates.
Yeah, that's a great point, and there's probably a whole webinar's worth that we could dig into there. So everything from around utility integration through the open ADR standard, so that you can react to demand response events, take advantage of economic opportunities as the price of power fluctuates, bi-directional charging. So and that's opening up now as vehicles start to be built to the ISO 15118 standard. So that's actually possible for buildings to make more intelligent decisions on where they're purchasing their power from, because it might actually come from vehicles for cheaper than they can get it from the grid. And so yeah, there's a whole bunch that's opening up as you get this ability to dynamically manage how those charging stations are operating.
So we've got a whole cohort of questions dealing with the struggles, we'll call them, between residents or tenants and councils, condo boards, etc. So I'm going to paraphrase, but we will address this glug. So first off, renters are in a bit of a different position than an owner of a condo or a strata unit. So what process can renters follow when they're in buildings with no councils or no boards? They don't have as much clout with their landlords. Any tips there?
I'd say if you live in a sort of purpose rental building, as in everyone in that building is a renter, you just want to be stating very clearly to your landlord that you have an EV and you want to have access to at-home EV charging, and indicate that you'd be willing to pay sensible amounts for that. It's important that they hear that kind of demand materialize. If you're a renter in a condominium, you want to be speaking to the owner of that unit so that they can then go and work with the condo board. But frankly, it is a challenge. It's sort of a long, slow process that takes time and is going to be best enabled when there is appropriate incentive and or financing programs in there to help make this easier for both rental building owners and condominium associations to implement this type of thing. But I'd say broadly, just getting organized, sort of stating your needs clearly, trying to find like-minded folks in the building are sort of the gist of what needs to happen. There are some sort of useful tools, let's say Plug and Drive in Ontario or MURBs or other sorts of organizations have done to help communicate that sort of demand to your landlord.
Yeah, I agree with what Brennan said there in terms of, I think the cards, honestly, if you don't have a cooperative landlord, I think the cards are somewhat stacked against you. Having said that, I think your next solution should be to look for options outside your building. I do know a number of EV owners who, the ideal scenario I would say is definitely to have the access to charging at home. But if you can't, I know a lot of EV owners who, then rely on maybe their place of employment, right? And instead of charging at home, their car's sitting at the office or wherever, and now they charge there. Or, if there's places nearby. I think the thought process on charging we talked about before probably will open up your opportunities from the standpoint that you can't think of charging, like Mike said, like you would think of, filling up a gas tank. A lot of people wait till the gas tank's empty and then they fill it up full. Charging's not like that. Charging is, I think, the best way for people that maybe aren't as electrically savvy to think about it is to look up and think about it in terms of kilometers. How many kilometers does a level 2 charger get me an hour? Okay, maybe it's 35 kilometers. Well, I commute to work 30 kilometers one way and I commute home 30 kilometers the other way. Oh, so that means I only need 2 hours of charging and my tank's full again, right? Like, I think that's the way people need to start thinking about charging, and then that will really unlock the opportunity for you.
Mm-hmm. And, if you want to be really civically minded, call up your minister responsible for energy and for utility regulation, for incentive programs at the provincial level, or your minister responsible for housing. These people actually do have meetings with regular citizens. I've done this myself and say, hey, this is a problem, feel my pain. And that's ultimately how we get the solutions at the scale that we need.
I mean, I'd also say, I mean, landlords are smart, right? And they know
Yeah.
their tenants, and they react some quicker than others, but generally they do react to consumer preferences, and some will lose out if they don't react quick enough. But EV charging, especially in affluent markets to begin with, is becoming a standard amenity that renters are asking for. Same thing in the hospitality sector, commercial leasing, like it is becoming something that people expect as a basic service, and so they are going to start voting with their feet. And condo owners, we find a lot of people are thinking about it in the same way, as kind of adding value to their unit if they have an EV charger. So we've got lots of condo residents or strata residents that are installing EV chargers, even if they don't have an EV today, but they might plan on it, or they might sell their unit and they see this as something that's going to hold value. So the perception of, it is changing pretty quickly because it's consumer driven first and foremost. So everyone is reacting, to that, and some people will be slow, but I think most landlords that we speak this is very much on their radar, and they know that they're going to lose out if they don't have a strategy.
Great. And just picking up on that thread, it was an audience question, actually. Curious if a unit with EV charging in the parking space can add value to the unit. If so, how much?
Has anyone seen any studies on this? I'm aware of a developer that, they're required to put in about $800 to $1,000 worth of infrastructure. And then they might be able to get charging stations for $1,500 to $2,000 in new construction. $1,500 to $2,000 is what their cost is. In new construction, they're charging $15,000 to install that charging station at time of occupancy, and they're apparently getting buyers. So evidently some people are willing in some markets to spend significant amounts of money on this, and they perceive it as adding that kind of value to their property. I'm not aware of any sort of studies of in different markets across the country what the average amount of value is. I can't imagine it would be that high, but I think over time, this is going to be increasingly something that really does add real value to the property. And the sooner condo associations recognize that, the better it'll be for all their residents.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the simple way, like we think about it, from if you were to talk to our sales and marketing group, is like, let's run through the natural progression of how people buy a home. Right? What are they looking for? Well, the first thing is, where are they going to live? Right? Once they figure that out, and then they kind of go down the list, and then eventually they're checking things off. So, I mean, I would agree that, like, if it's where to buy a home, then, does it have a parking spot? And then does that parking spot have an EV charger? I think you will eventually get there. I think it's the difference between yes and no right now in terms of where people buy. I don't know if it necessarily is, quantifiable to say, hey, my property sold for this much more because of an EV charger. But I think eventually, you may be able to start quantifying it, and the sites that are the slowest adopters will probably start to be punished as a result of that.
I have to hit the buzzer. I'm sorry, everyone. It was a really great discussion, and we covered a lot of area. I know we could have kept going for another hour, but thank you all so much for joining, and this was a great way to end our series. So very appreciative, and I will hand it back to Nino.
Our pleasure.
Well, thank you, Emma, for moderating the discussion, and a big thanks to the panel, Graeme, Reid, Mike, and Brendan, for bringing your expertise forward and just stepping up to answer all of those questions. Thank you to everyone in the audience, and to especially for all of those questions. And for those of you who didn't get your questions answered, we're going to work with our sponsor SWTCH to arrange follow-up to as many of those questions as possible. And on that note, a big thank you to SWTCH for sponsoring today's discussion. And they, as you know, they and as you've heard, they really are experts in this field and are really making a difference in tackling this problem, or this opportunity and challenge. Finally, we're excited to give you, our audience today, an exclusive preview of a major event we're planning next year. The EV and Charging Expo is scheduled to take place on May 17th and 18th at the Enercare Centre in Toronto. After this webinar closes, Zoom should open a page on your browser that enables you to register your interest for that event. And there will be a lot of content on this topic, on the opportunities and challenges around condos and MURBs and strata as well. will be discussed and featured at that event. So thanks for joining us for this 5-part series, and thanks to all the 20 speakers who have taken part and the many members in the audience who have gotten involved with their questions and participation. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next year.